The landing gear wouldn't drop. Metal screamed against the wind like a living thing being torn apart, and somewhere behind the cockpit door, a calm voice said, "Tell my wife the blue toolbox is still under the seat." Before you watch the full story, comment below, which country are you watching from? And don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story might be even bigger. Harold Finch sat in seat 14C wearing the same faded gray jacket he wore to the grocery store. His hands rested on a dented blue toolbox that looked older than most of the passengers. The flight attendant smiled the way people smile at old men who take too long boarding. The captain walked past without a second glance. Even the first officer, checking overhead bins, muttered to a colleague, "Just some retired bus driver. Probably never been higher than a highway overpass." Harold heard it. He didn't look up. He only tightened his grip on the toolbox handle the way he used to grip the steering wheel on Route 9 when the rain came sideways. He remembered the night his mentor, old Cap Reynolds, had handed him that same toolbox after the last training flight. Cap's voice still lived in his ears. "Kid, when the ground starts rising too fast, you don't pray first. You listen to the metal. It always tells the truth before the gauges do." Harold had been 23 then. Now the hair under his baseball cap was white, and the only people who still called him Kid were long gone. The cabin lights were soft. A businessman 2 rows up complained about the coffee. A little girl across the aisle drew circles on the window with her finger. The plane climbed through scattered clouds, engine steady, everything ordinary. Harold opened the toolbox just enough to check the contents. One specific 3/4-inch combination wrench with a blue paint mark on the handle, the same wrench Cap had used to teach him how to feel play in a landing gear actuator by hand. He closed it again and stared at the seat back in front of him. 20 minutes later, the first wrong detail arrived like a quiet cough. The hydraulic pressure indicator on the overhead panel flickered once, so briefly most people missed it. Harold's eyes tracked it. He said nothing. The first officer noticed the same flicker and tapped the glass, frowning. Stage 1. 10 minutes after that, the left main gear door light stayed amber instead of green. The captain's voice stayed smooth over the intercom. "Folks, we're still climbing. Nothing to worry about." But Harold watched the way the first officer's shoulders tightened. Stage 2. Then the master caution light came on solid, and the word gear flashed in red. The cabin went quiet the way rooms do when people realize the adults have stopped smiling. Stage 3. Harold stood. The toolbox was already in his hand. A flight attendant blocked the aisle. "Sir, please remain seated." He kept his voice low. "I need to speak to the captain." She shook her head. The businessman from earlier barked, "Sit down, old man, you're not helping." Harold looked at the first officer through the open cockpit door. Stage 4 sat heavy in his chest. Stay quiet and let trained men handle it, or open his mouth and become the retired bus driver who thought he knew better than the airline. Stay with me here, because what happens next is the part nobody saw coming. Would you have stayed in your seat, or would you have risked looking like a fool to try and save 200 strangers? The first officer stepped into the aisle, voice clipped. "Sir, return to your seat immediately." Harold held up the toolbox. "I've got 37 years on heavy equipment hydraulics. Your left main actuator is binding. I can feel it from here." The first officer laughed once, short and sharp. "You're a bus driver." Behind him, the captain appeared, face tight. "We don't have time for this." Harold opened the toolbox, pulled out the blue-marked wrench, and set it on the bulkhead. "This wrench was used on the same model actuator your plane carries. Let me show you the play." He demonstrated a tiny rocking motion with 2 fingers, the exact tolerance Cap had drilled into him decades earlier. The first officer's eyes changed. The captain stared at the wrench, then at Harold's hands, scarred, steady, not shaking. "Get him in here," the captain said. They moved him into the jump seat. The toolbox rested open on the floor between them, the blue wrench still in Harold's palm. Outside the windows, the clouds had thickened. The left gear remained stubbornly half-deployed. Harold's voice stayed level while he talked them through the manual extension sequence. calling out pressures and valve positions the way he once called out mile markers on long night runs. Hold the emergency pump at 3,000 until you feel the secondary lock engage. Don't force it past that or you'll shear the pin. The first officer's hands moved exactly as directed. Then the secondary lock light stayed dark. Crisis inside the crisis. Harold leaned forward, close enough that the captain could hear him breathe. Cap used to say the metal always tells the truth before the gauges do. The prophetic line landed soft, almost private. For one heartbeat, Harold's free hand rested on the toolbox lid the way a man rests a hand on a friend's shoulder. Then he guided them through the override, counting the strokes out loud. The gear locked with a solid mechanical clunk that traveled through the airframe. Imperfect. One door stayed slightly open, but the green light finally came on. When the wheels touched runway, the whole cabin exhaled at once. Harold's shoulders dropped so hard his jacket slipped. The first person to speak was the little girl across the aisle, whispering. The old man fixed it. The businessman who had ordered him to sit down stood in the aisle, face gray, and simply said, I was wrong. The captain stepped out of the cockpit, looked Harold in the eye in front of every passenger and said, This aircraft is on the ground because of Harold Finch, not the manuals. Him. At the gate, Cap Reynolds, now 92, waiting with a walker, took the blue toolbox from Harold's hands like it was something sacred. Told you the metal never lies, kid. 3 years later, Harold still drives the same quiet streets he always did, only now the toolbox rides in the passenger seat of his old pickup instead of under a bus. Some evenings, Cap sits on the porch with him and they don't talk much. Once Cap said, You didn't save a plane that day. You just remembered what the ground feels like when it comes up honest. Harold nodded, turned the blue wrench over in his fingers, and watched the sun go down the same way he used to watch the road. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. There's a new one waiting for you tomorrow. The toolbox sits open on a kitchen table, the blue wrench catching the last light of evening, waiting for whatever the metal decides to say next.